Have you ever heard an American say the word soccer and thought to yourself, what an idiot, it's called football? Or maybe you've noticed that Americans don't say aluminium, but aluminum. Have you heard your favorite Girl Gone London YouTuber say the word gotten and you immediately despair for the English language? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I've got some interesting news for you. Now, there are many ways in which Americans have taken complete liberty over the English language, and not so much in a liberty and justice for all sort of way, but kind of in a we don't want to be like anyone else, so now we're just making stuff up kind of way. But some American words, including some that might surprise you, because they definitely surprised me, have a fascinating origin story that traces itself back to across the pond. Let's start with word 1, gotten. Gotten is used in American English as a past tense of got. This is rarely used in the UK. In the present day, gotten isn't an Americanism. The Oxford English Dictionary traces it back to British origin in the 4th century. It's been used by everyone from Shakespeare to Francis Bacon. Around the time that the English settlers came to America, this was still very much a part of their language. So similar to their cheeses and their pie recipes, they carried it across the pond with them to a new land where it was continued to be said. Then England collectively changed its mind for some reason and were like, nope, we're done with this word. So now in British English, it's more common to say got, while these crazy Americans are still saying gotten. But it wasn't the Americans who changed it. It was the British who used it, brought it over, and then changed what they said back home. Next up is one of the more surprising ones to me, and I say that as someone interested in UK and US differences for a long time. I've never actually known about this one. We all know that this sport is called soccer in the US and football in Great Britain. And you might think that because the sport originated in Great Britain, the term soccer must be an Americanism. Surprisingly, no. The word soccer is actually British in origin. To understand what happened, we need to travel back to 1863. In this year, football had gotten its first set of written down rules, and the Football Association was formed in England. However, rugby at the time was also called football, as in rugby football, and this meant they needed to distinguish between the two types of football. So this sport became known as association football. And of course, like many things in the UK, they got nicknames. It started in the 1880s when University of Oxford students started calling rugby ruggers and association football ASOC football. That was then shortened to a soccer, which was then shortened to soccer. It was never an official name for the sport, it was always a nickname, but it did spread around. Football as a name for the sport in the UK became more popular in the 20th century when the word football was dropped from rugby, so now rugby could just be called rugby, and the sport was free to just be called football. By this point, though, soccer and football were used in countries around the world relatively interchangeably to refer to association football. In the case of the US, though, American football, this sport, was increasingly popular in the States, and so this sport earned the title of football in the US, whereas soccer was exclusively used for this sport to differentiate between the two. The US did have the United States Football Association, which formed in the 1910s, but by 1945 they changed it to the US Soccer Football Association, and eventually they got rid of the word football to refer to the sport altogether. So the development of the use of the word soccer in the US does have its own origins related to what was popular in America at the time, but Americans didn't come up with the word. And in fact, the reason football became known as football in the UK was simply because rugby football got relegated when it came to the name. It could have gone the other way. Next up, the classic aluminum versus aluminium debate. If you're really into watching channels like mine, you might already be familiar with the fact that Brits say aluminium and Americans say aluminum. They refer to the same thing, but they are spelled differently. It's not just a pronunciation difference. The debate over who's right is less interesting to me as the reason for the difference. Did someone play a bad game of chemical telephone and misheard what was trying to be said? Was this Noah Webster's crazy idea? And actually, while Noah Webster did eventually choose the aluminum spelling for the US, he actually didn't make it up or go rogue on this one. The British chemist, Sir Humphrey Davy, refers to this unique element in his publication in 1808 as alumium, using the Latin base of alumina. He didn't actually manage to isolate this element yet, but he refers to his experiment where he's trying to. Then, in 1812, he changes his mind once again and goes for the term aluminum. At this point, I feel like somebody must have been asking him, is this your final answer? But he probably had been exposed to so many chemicals at this point, so we will forgive him. The problem came when someone else, right around this time, gave a review of one of Davy's lectures and instead refers to the element as aluminium. There was precedent for this, as it could then follow the format of other elements like potassium or sodium. Then, in 1828, Noah Webster went ahead and used both aluminum and aluminium in his work to show that they were both used. But fast forward 100 years, and by 1934, aluminum is noted down in the American dictionary as the preferred pronunciation, and aluminium is noted down as particularly British. Today, aluminum is used exclusively among the American public and most American chemists, but aluminium is used in the UK and is adopted by the International Union of Chemistry as of 1990, so it does leave Americans as the odd one out, but again, they were only using the original term. Now let's address a pretty noticeable one to many. If you've heard an American talking about the seasons, we typically say fall instead of autumn. Both are used within the US, and in fact, you can find both used within the UK. But if I had to pick which country uses which most often, it's pretty acceptable to generalize that in the US we say fall, and in the UK they say autumn. Now, autumn is the older word. It first started being used in the 1300s from a Latin word autumnus, and it helped separate the term harvest from the season, because harvest had previously been used to refer to the season, but they also needed it to be able to be referred to the actual harvest. And so autumn comes about. In the 1600s in England, however, they started to get a bit more literal and noticed that all of the leaves were falling from the trees, and soon it was called the fall of the leaves. And what happened in the 1600s? All those Brits with their cheese and pie recipes and linguistic tendencies show up to the New World and continued to use the word that they used back home. But while they were throwing tea in the harbor and generally wreaking havoc, the Brits back home decided that fall was a bit unsophisticated, and so they went back to autumn as the primary name for the season to get back to the Latin and French roots. Thus, most Brits today still say autumn, as I've suggested, while most Americans still say fall, but the word fall was a British import into the US. They just changed their minds later on. And our last word, one of the words that are pretty exclusively separated across the pond, diaper in the US and nappy in the UK. It would be very rare to hear the other word in the country it's not primarily used in, but the word diaper actually didn't start in America. Diaper in Europe in the medieval period was a name for a kind of woven fabric, and specifically by the 15th century, it was a linen fabric that was woven with a small repeating pattern. In the UK, diaper fabric, as it was called, was used for tablecloths, towels, and small cloths. Shakespeare himself even uses the term diaper in Taming of the Shrew, though he's referring to a hand towel. In the US, this diaper style of fabric and weave started to be used for babies, and thus the term diaper still stuck. Even if today it doesn't specifically refer to the type of fabric, but really just refers to anything that you use on a baby, even if it's cloth or synthetic. In the UK though, the most popular fabric used for babies was a type of cotton terry towel, not the diaper type of fabric. So it didn't make as much sense in the UK to adopt the word diaper in the same way, but it's interesting that Americans took the word diaper from the British origins and never adopted nappy. This brings us to the end of this video. Comment below to let me know which one of these was the most surprising to you. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.